Hey, I'm whistling. Would you like to whistle too? Whistle FM is looking for a few good volunteers. Come and join our team and learn a new skill. We're looking for producers, show hosts, and even people to help out around the station. Learn something new and meet new people. Email us at admin@whistleradio.com or drop by the station behind Stillville Fine Furniture. We hope to see you soon.
Hey everyone, this is Lil J. Join me every Saturday night at 11 p.m. Eastern for the Block Party. A 2-hour journey of the best in the Canadian underground dance music scene, featuring tracks and DJ mixes from Canada's emerging artists, from the disco hits of the 70s to the latest dance floor fillers. No lineups or cover charges, it's your weekly free access to the beats that are packing dance floors in Canada and around the world. The Block Party, Saturday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern, right here on 102.9 Whistle FM.
And we are back on Fresh Waves. I'm your host, Bren Masson, and we're speaking with Dayna Laxton this morning. Dayna, let's continue our conversation about invasive plants before we get into invasive bugs, which is a little more creepy. But invasive plants, we've just touched on some of the really bad ones.
Yep.
What are a couple of names of just good plants to plant in and around the York Regional Forest? Because we're virtually, if you're planting on the fence, the roots are going to go under, so we might as well be planting something that the forest likes.
Right. So a lot of native ferns are found in the understory of a forest, so those would be safe. They like shadier locations, sometimes a little bit more moist, but ferns are some of my personal favorite.
Me too. I love them.
Ostrich ferns in particular. If you have drier areas, you can do some of the more showy goldenrods, zigzag goldenrod. Those are big with butterflies and bees as well.
Aren't people allergic to those?
See, that's an interesting thing. I'm glad that you brought that up. Tis the season of ragweed,
yes,
and hay fever. So people who may suffer from hay fever can sympathize. But it's a huge misconception or misunderstanding that goldenrod is the cause of your allergies. Goldenrod you see in the fields and you see everywhere, but it just so happens that it blooms at the same time as ragweed.
Okay.
Ragweed is not goldenrod. There's many different species of goldenrod, and they all have yellow flowers. Ragweed actually has a very indespicable green sort of spike of a flower that you can't even... People would look at it and be like, that's a flower. So only plant nerds would say that's the flower. And it is a very tiny, fine pollen that is wind spread.
Okay.
That's what you're breathing in. Goldenrods have a big, sticky pollen that attracts insects. And so they are pollinated by insects going from plant to plant. But the ragweed, because they don't have a showy flower, none of the insects pay any attention to it. And so it requires, or it depends on the wind to do cross-pollination. And it's a much finer, lighter pollen, and that's what you actually breathe into your nose, and that's what ends up irritating your sinus cavities and your sinus tissue. So that's the result of your hay fever. And so that's one of the big misconceptions. It's never been goldenrod, and I can assure you that is the cause of your hay fever.
Isn't that interesting? Because you think that it's so, I guess people just say, oh, it must be that one, because there's so much of it at this time of the year.
That's what it is.
I actually find it really pretty. Mind you, I think dandelions are pretty. I know you're not supposed to. Are they invasive, dandelions?
They are considered non-native and potentially invasive depending on the situation. But yeah, they're so common. But as you notice, you sort of get that ramp up in the spring, and then you might see a few here and there. It's not like they persist on the landscape forever and ever. But they are a key pollen source for pollinators.
Okay.
Whether you like them or not.
They're very edible.
They are, yep.
Top to bottom. Goldenrod's the same. There isn't a part of the goldenrod that's not edible. And it's kind of weird when you get some of the invasive species are actually edible.
Yep. Well, when you think of it, it's because they probably were brought to our continent from Eurasia, as most of our invasive plants have. And that's because they have a history of either medicinal use or for food, eating.
A food source. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So, we could plant any number of things, and there are places to go online, like you said.
Yeah. So yourleaf.org would have fantastic examples of native plants, shrubs, and flower species that you could plant in your backyard.
Yourleaf.org. Okay. So let's talk about the bugs. Then again, I'm thinking to myself, we probably should talk about the grass, because grass is also an invasive species, some grass. And some grass is ornamental. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was looking for something easy to plant in my garden, I said, what about that stuff? It looks so nice. And then my daughter had grass allergies, so I thought I wouldn't bother. Right. And now I'm glad I didn't, because I've just been reading that it's not the best. So we'll stay on plants just while we talk about grass, and then we'll switch over to bugs in a minute. But grass.
So there's two main grass plants that I would say are our top contenders in terms of noxious invasive grasses or reeds. One of them is miscanthus. Miscanthus is a showy ornamental grass that you can buy in your local garden center. It has a really kind of funny white paintbrush sort of top to it, and there are cases of escaped miscanthus patches that are starting to run down the ditches and out of people's backyards into meadows and open fields and things like that. Okay. So you can see a lot of it in the Mount Albert area, as well as on Metro Road, Woodbine, in Georgina. There's a bunch of escapees where they're just sort of just taking off down the highway as fast as plants can take off. And then the next one I would say that is probably the more popular of the two is Phragmites, or European common reed it's called. But most people end up calling it Phragmites, and that's the European reed that's like 10 feet tall that you see along the sides of all of our major roads.
With the big fan kind of thing at the top?
Yeah, purpley, and then it gets lighter as the winter comes on.
It's so pretty.
Yeah, if you think so. But that plant is probably the worst invasive grass, if you will.
Well, it's so common everywhere.
Yes, and it spreads by rhizomes, so roots under the ground. It can spread by seed, but I've been told that that's much lower probability. It's mainly spreading by pieces of itself. So if we mow it and we spread it down the ditch, then we're helping it spread. And that's why you see it in the ditches, because it's running with its rhizomes underground and then sending up more shoots. And the problem with this plant, not just because it's filling in our ditches, but when it's moving along our road networks and it finds a wetland or an open area that's all cattails and marsh, it will literally take over and push out all those cattails. It will fill in the water, open water. It will dry up that wetland, and we will lose basically that habitat and all the species in it.
Okay, if it's the same thing I'm thinking of, though, it's everywhere.
Yes, it is.
That really tall grass that has a fanny purpley top.
It's all along the 400 series highways and local roads. People sometimes have it in their backyard. If you have water, it will be there.
So how do people get rid of it? Do you dig it out?
You can. It's really, really labor intensive and near possible to get, again, all of those roots. The easier way to manage for Phragmites is to actually cut it 2 times a year. And the best time to do that is when it starts to get its seed head formed. When it's a new seed head, it will be sort of that burgundy purple color. Mm-hmm. Mow it down. Let it sort of the roots panic because they want to make seeds, right? So they panic. They send all their energy out of the rhizomes back up and trying to make new shoots. So then you cut it again about a month later. And that'll zap out all that energy from the roots, and you have to do this again. This is similar to the dog strangling vine. You want to zap the energy out of the rhizomes, so you got to be persistent, and you go back and you do this year after year, and you'll slowly see a decrease of the plant. But it's really labor intensive. It's really not, you don't have like a one shot and done sort of option unless you're using herbicide, so pesticides, which we have the Pesticide Act, which prevents laymen from using chemicals. And then there's certain exceptions under that act that would allow certain land managers to actually spray Phragmites. But if you're a private landowner, Joe Blow, and you have it in your wetland or whatever, I can already tell you're not going to be using an herbicide that's effective. Plus, there's nothing available on the market to use over water or around water.
Right, exactly.
And Phragmites is near water 90%
Even the
of
ditches,
the time.
yeah, it would probably not be because those ditches often go into, like, they run quite far distances and end up in wetlands and things like that.
Right. So
that's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Now, what about this prescribed burn that I was reading about recently, where you guys had done a prescribed burn to get rid of a bunch of grasses so that the natural grass could grow up?
Yeah, so for the first time in York Regional Forest history, we conducted a controlled burn of tallgrass prairie habitat at our Brenner and Graves tract in East Gwillimbury. Mm-hmm. And so there's about 7 hectares of tallgrass prairie that was planted there. However, the creation site or the project site is within the historical range of native tallgrass prairie that once covered a significant proportion of southern Ontario. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we don't see tallgrass habitat here anymore is that during early European settlement, everyone's coming over to Ontario and they have their choice of setting up their home and their farmstead in an open field or tallgrass prairie versus a forest. Which one's less work to start up shop, right? Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, all of our tallgrass open habitat was targeted for agriculture and destroyed. And so then we lost that habitat type. And it is a significant habitat type because it's controlled or maintained by wildfire.
Okay.
And we also now live in a fire-adverse society. We don't let wildfires just do their own thing. So, as a result, natural succession of these areas is you would start to get seeds blowing in or moving in by wildlife for trees and shrubs, and over time you would then get a forest. So any tallgrass prairie that was in southern Ontario that wasn't allowed to burn has turned into forest or a farm or development at this point. And so in York Region, we recognize this natural history piece and thought, well, we have the property and we're in the historical range. Why don't we put some of this landscape or this habitat type back on the landscape? And so we worked with Tallgrass Ontario, which is a fantastic NGO based out of southwestern Ontario, who are the end-all and be-all when it comes to tallgrass habitat. They're the promoters of some of the historical remnants that are still in the province. And so we worked with them to seed it. We let it grow for 4 years, and then it was advised by some ecological specialists that we consulted with, both at Tallgrass Ontario and Nature Conservancy of Canada, and they both said this site is ready for a controlled burn. So we hired a consultant, and there are people out there that are professional pyros, and they go out, they're called burn bosses. They have provincial level training in how to set, control, and extinguish fire in a natural ecosystem. And so we lit it on fire on March 26th this year, and it was successful, went off without a hitch, and the prairie, if you go out there now, you would never even know that it was burned.
Yeah. I used to work for MNR, and we did a couple of prescribed burns. It's fascinating. Mm-hmm. Well, fire is a part of nature. You know, every now and again, lightning strikes, as they know out in BC too well this year. Mm-hmm. But lightning strikes, it burns. There are certain plants that only let their seeds out when they're under extreme heat.
Correct. So,
you know, black spruce and things like that.
Jack pine.
They need that blast of lightning to germinate and to make new trees.
And so that's the same thing with a lot of the tallgrass prairie species. So we're talking about grasses and wildflowers. That's what make up a tallgrass habitat for the most part. And their seeds are fire resistant. And they also enjoy the chemistry of the soil right after a fire. So they actually flourish after a fire. And then plants that are already growing there when the fire sweeps through, they've actually grown with 65% of their biomass below ground. So as roots. Mm-hmm. So that when fire sweeps through, they're able to resprout no problem because they have 65% of their original energy below ground.
That's amazing. Mm-hmm. Now you get that going and all of a sudden you've created a whole ecosystem of food for deer and other things, and it all contributes. Deer love a meadow.
Right. And we have so many different birds now. There are quite a number of avid birders that use the York Regional Forest.
Aileen, if you're listening.
Yeah, Aileen Barkley. And so they have been spotting some really interesting species. We just had an observation of a sedge wren that has never been recorded in York Region before.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's from
And
the
it was
prairie
at our
grass.
prairie. Yep.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So it's an exciting project to work on. And there are always concerns about how do you maintain a intentionally lit fire? How do you keep it controlled? It's called controlled burn for a reason, and that's because we put a number of steps in place through guidance with the consultant, the burn boss. And we had the entire perimeter of the area that was to be set on fire was mowed many times in advance to remove the fuel.
Right.
So there's nothing to burn. It was almost right down to soil. Then what happens is on the day before they ignite, we actually pre-wet with ATV sprayers, and we wet that burn break. So now it's wet. Fire doesn't like wet anything. And then they light the fire or the fire lines in certain ways so that the fire is always burning into itself. And a controlled burn always self-extinguishes.
Right,
We don't
that's one
have
of the
to
ways-
fight the fire. It puts itself out because it runs out of fuel.
That's one of the things that they do in a forest fire, too, is start another fire that meets with the main fire, and then they put themselves out.
Right.
Yeah. It was interesting. There is a video on that on your website, so that if someone is interested in seeing it, they can go and watch the video of it. And it is really fascinating to see the fire when the two sides hit each other.
The
and
drone
it just,
footage. Yeah. So we were fortunate enough to have a drone on the day, so they were able to capture the footage of the burn from the sky, which is totally cool. But yeah, the video that we made to showcase this project is at york.ca/YRF. And then, we're actually planning a second burn in Nobleton. We're working with the King Township Fire Department on this one, again with our burn boss. And this is a bigger one. It's about 15 hectares in size. It's the same habitat type, so it's endangered tallgrass prairie habitat that we worked with Tallgrass Ontario to plant. And it is due for a fire, so we are hoping to burn between November 1st and January 31st.
Nice. Well, good luck with that. That'll be fun. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Fresh Waves on Whistle FM, and we're talking with Dayna from the York Region Forest.
Forestry.
And we'll be back in a second to talk a little bit about bugs. Stay tuned.
Hi folks, Kim Mitchell here. You know, however you choose to get around, your ATV, your snowmobile, your boat, car, if you have a motorcycle, all these things take 100% of your attention and skill to operate safely. Alcohol impairs that, and bad things can happen. So, be smart, okay? You know what I'm going to say next.
This message brought to you from the Safe and Sober Awareness Committee.
You're listening to Fresh Waves. We're back in the station. We've got Dayna here from the York Regional Forestry.
Natural Heritage and Forestry at York Region. Yep. It's a mouthful.
You guys have too long titles. I mean, when Kevin Reese comes in, I just say, we've got Kevin in the studio this morning, because if I had to do his title, I think it takes up 3 lines at the bottom of his emails. Anyway, just to keep it simple, you're from York Region.
Correct.
In the forestry department.
Correct.
And there are a ton of bugs now in the forest. Some bugs are good. Some bugs birds need to eat. Other things need to eat. The bugs eat the rotten stuff, and on and on and on it goes. It's a big ecosystem, and bugs are a really big part of it, as we said before. The bugs are kind of like the base. So many things eat bugs. We need the bugs.
100%.
This year we have a ton of caterpillars. I have never seen such caterpillar nests as on my street and streets around me when I'm walking in the forest this year. And I've done 3 or 4 different tracts, and they're massive. They're the size of giant wasp nests, and they're just all cocoons of caterpillars.
Yeah, so one thing that people don't know, for the most part, is that a lot of insects have cyclical life cycles, and their populations boom on a weird schedule. Mm-hmm. So that's why quite often you'll see a bunch of tent caterpillar nests one year and then nothing the next.
Right.
So I don't know what drives it. but there is some science on certain species that they can say every 7th year on the dot, there's going to be an explosion of this particular bug on this year. But yeah, the insect world is fascinating, and it outnumbers all of the other species on the planet.
Yes, they say at the Toronto Zoo there's a really neat sign that says that if all of the spiders on Earth went to one side of the Earth, it would actually throw the orbit off.
Oh, that's gross.
Because there's that many spiders. I know, isn't that awful? I went to Costa Rica last year. Let me tell you, that's one of the things that I didn't like was the snakes and the spiders.
Yeah.
But anyway, so there is this emerald ash borer.
Yeah.
And what is a borer? It's still a bug.
Yeah, so it's a beetle, and it bores. Borer, meaning it bores into the wood of the tree.
And you can tell because there'll be pieces of bark that look like they're pushed off of the tree, and some spots are bald, but it's halfway up. It's not at the bottom.
Yeah, so that's usually on a dying tree, unfortunately. Yes. You start to see the bark come off, and the space between the bark is just an air gap because the wood's drying out and the bark is coming off. But in terms of like, is it teeming with beetles underneath and they're all like lifting the bark up? No. But
they're doing their job.
Yeah, emerald ash borer has been in York region since 2008. It was first found in Vaughan, bordering with Toronto. City of Toronto got it before us. Where
does it come from?
So it's from northeastern Asia, and it feeds on ash trees in China. But over there, it has natural enemies, such as like these parasitic wasps. If I want to get all like, I can get like Halloween, ooky spooky, gory. Yes. And so over in China, they have these natural predators that actually seek out either the worm form of the beetle, which is the damaging form. That's the worm that eats the living tissue under the bark. That's the action that actually ends up killing the ash tree.
Right.
And these parasitic wasps can actually hear them munching away under the bark.
Cool.
And they stick their little egg-laying needle that's on their bum through the bark into the larvae, and they inject eggs into the larvae, and their eggs end up eating the larvae from the inside out, surviving on the larvae, killing the larvae.
That is like a science fiction movie,
right?
Isn't it?
And so there's one that does that to the larvae, and there's one that seeks out the eggs of the emerald ash borer. So before they hatch and turn into the worm form, and they'll do the same thing. They inject their egg into the egg of an emerald ash borer. So the population of emerald ash borer is kept in check because there's this enemy or foe of the emerald ash borer that helps keep it in control. But when it got introduced to North America, which they suspect was first in Michigan, and they now suspect it was here since the 1990s, and that's how long it went undetected, because they didn't actually detect it or positively identify it until 2002.
Okay.
And they suspect it came on untreated pallet wood crates or something like that from international trade. And so it's been moving both naturally and assisted from us lovely humans by moving firewood. Right. So now the regulated area is all the way up through probably a good southern, I would say a third portion of southern Quebec, and all the way up past Sudbury for us here in Ontario. And so what that means is you can move firewood within the regulated area, but you cannot move firewood outside of that area.
Yeah, so if you have a cottage in Kenora, you can't take firewood from here to Kenora.
Right. So in theory, good practice is that you shouldn't be moving firewood anywhere. You should be buying it local and burning it local. And so that's how in cottage country emerald ash borer showed up like 2 years after the city of Toronto had it, was because people were cutting down their ash trees, taking the wood up north to their cottage, and then boom, cottage country all of a sudden has emerald ash borer because it wasn't moving that fast on its own. Right.
What a nasty little creature.
It's cost us a lot of money as private landowners, taxpayers, the government. Everyone, the only way to handle this bug, because it's just widespread devastation, is that everyone's had to take care of their own, if you will. So as a private landowner, I have an ash tree and it's infected. I can either look at getting it treated or I get it removed. As the region, we're looking at our ash trees in the York Regional Forest or along regional roads. We're treating some, we're removing the rest, because unfortunately, if you don't treat it, they will die.
One of our listeners actually asked me yesterday, to ask you if the York Regional Forest is going to cut down every ash tree that is in the forest.
No.
Okay.
So what we're doing in the York Regional Forest is we are looking at it as a hazard tree issue, because it is. Ash trees, unlike some species of trees, they fault really quickly. So what that means is they will snap off and fall over. Unlike oak trees, standing oak trees, something can be dead and be a wildlife pole for years and be low risk. Ash trees, unfortunately, are a faster growing, weaker species. They will break at the bottom and fall over really quickly after they die. Mm-hmm. So we have to treat them like a hazard tree rather. And so we are removing them preventatively, but we're only removing trees within felling distance or striking distance of shared fence lines, boundary lines, and our trails. If there's ash in the middle of the forest in stands that are nowhere close to trail, they'll stay there and they'll continue to persist for however long they do, fall over, decompose, stay there, be a part of the forest ecosystem. But we have to proactively remove any trees that are within striking distance from a risk standpoint.
Well, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
Yep.
Now, I guess you couldn't bring in these parasitic wasps because then you've introduced another species to the ecosystem here that is not friendly. It's an invasive species. So that really doesn't work either, does it?
Actually, so they have brought over 2 of the parasitic wasp species. It's called biocontrol or biological control. So we have done this with other examples, like with purple loosestrife, where we had 3 beetle species released in the 90s to eat different parts of purple loosestrife plants to reduce their seed production and stop their spread. And that's actually been pretty successful.
Now, what is that plant? Is that the one that's in the swamps?
Purple loosestrife, yes, is like that fuchsia rod-like flower. It's actually very pretty, but it takes over completely.
I dig it out of the lake.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And so that's a really good example of how biocontrol can work to our favor. There's been a lot of science since the 90s and a lot more stringent testing, and there's a complete protocol in laboratories that happens in the backstage that we don't ever hear about, but it comes out as official reports nonetheless. So, I mean, you can find the information if you want to go looking for it, but is it making, media headlines? No. But so years worth of research is done on potential predators for some of these species that we know we won't ever be able to eradicate from our landscape once they've been introduced. So dog strangling vine is another one. So researchers are they're finding their natural predators and they're running trials to see whether or not those natural predators will come after any of our native species and do further damage if we were to introduce them. And so once they do all this very strict trial, if there's even a glimmer of the potential that something might go awry, it does not get approved. But anyway, so there's been 2 species of these parasitic wasps that have been approved for release. The United States have been releasing them for the last 10 years.
Wow.
And we actually have Natural Resources Canada releasing them in Ontario and Quebec since probably 5 or 6 years ago. So they are here and they are being released.
What is a parasitic wasp versus a regular wasp?
So the parasitic word is just its role because it's a parasite to the emerald ash borer. But it's a wasp. It is in the wasp family, but its stinger is actually, it doesn't have a stinger. All it has is that egg-laying little straw. So it's completely stingless, completely harmless, and it's actually super tiny. Like the size of a crumb.
All right. If it's not going to bite me, I'm happy with it.
No. Yep.
Yeah. So, well, we could continue this for another hour or 2. There's so much to talk about in this realm, and we've only talked about one bug, and I know that there's more than one menacing little bug to talk about. Yeah. Please come back again.
Sure.
Come back and talk to us, and we'd really love to hear anything you have to say, because I think as people who live in and around the York Region Forest and who play in the York Regional Forest, I use the word play, but we use it for recreation, for our pets, for ourselves. We walk, we snowshoe, we cross-country ski in the York Region Forest. All of us need to be forest stewards and take care of this beautiful resource. You look at the people who live in downtown and other places where they don't have access to this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place, and we have to protect it. And it means that all of us have to be vigilant, because we all play a role in protecting it or destroying it. And I'd rather be on the side of protection myself.
Exactly.
So thank you very much for joining us. How do people get a hold of you if they have questions?
If they really need to pop quiz me on anything, they can send me an email at dayna.laxton@york.ca. So it's dayna.laxton@york.ca. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that they have. But honestly, if I can, I'd like to plug some resources out there that honestly will be able to answer your questions better than I. And that's if you can check out EDMAPS Ontario, so EDDMAPS, and that's EDMAPS. So that stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. Super cool. You can go in. They have an interactive map. You can look it up by species, and you can see what sort of invasive species have been reported and confirmed around your neighborhood, your house, etc. And then our fantastic partners at the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, like I said, they have best management practices and fact sheets and that Grow Me Instead guide on their web. They have a fun Invader Raider kids activity book as well that you can download. There's the Invasive Species Awareness Program they're like the original invading species program in Ontario, and they have fantastic resources as well. And then there's the Invasive Species Center, which is our federal invasive species information center. They have, again, fact sheets, resources, a network of specialists that you can reach out to.
And LEAF.
And definitely check out LEAF if you're interested in learning what to plant and what LEAF can offer you. Like I said, there's do-it-yourself and full service, and everything you need to know about LEAF is at yourleaf.org.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Jay, that's a wrap for today. Thanks for listening to Fresh Waves. We hope you've enjoyed the show. If you have any comments or stories, just drop us a line. We love to hear your stories, and we love to have your questions. And you can get a hold of me at bren@freshwaves.ca. You can also tweet us and all this kind of stuff that Jay's in charge of. Jay, how do people get us?
All right. Thank you very much, Bren. You can get us on Twitter at Fresh Waves Radio. We also have a Facebook page, Fresh Waves on Whistle FM.
Thanks a lot. Everybody have a great day. Be kind and have a fabulous, fabulous fresh day. You've been listening to Fresh Waves, a Whistle FM production. I'm your host, Brenda Masson, and our technical producer is Jason Rumball. Tune in every Wednesday at 10 a.m. for Fresh Waves here on Whistle FM, 102.9 on the FM dial and whistlefm.com anywhere in the world. Fresh Waves is available on podcast too. Just go to whistlefm.ca or freshwaves.ca. We podcast all of the Fresh Waves shows so that you can listen at your leisure. Fresh Waves. It really is fresh.